By sunset, the prairie fire had swallowed 6 miles of grass and trapped 12 children inside the Red Hollow schoolhouse. Every good horse in town fought its reins the moment the wind carried smoke across the road. One wagon overturned before it traveled 50 yards, and nobody offered to try again. Then Mara Ellison brought out the scarred gray mule Silas Boone had given her because no ranch hand wanted him. Cinder ignored the shouting men, the church bell, and the crack of burning fence posts beyond the ridge. Silas shouted that the mule was too stupid to understand what was coming. Mara laid 2 fingers against Cinder's neck, pulled once on the left rein, and the mule stepped toward the smoke. No one in Red Hollow knew yet that Cinder was not calm because he was stupid. He was calm because most of the terrible noise could no longer reach him. Before darkness fell, the flaw that made him worthless would become the only reason those children had a road home. 4 months earlier, Mara Ellison had buried her husband beneath a cottonwood behind their small eastern Colorado homestead. Thomas Ellison had survived cattle drives, winter storms, and a broken shoulder before pneumonia took him in 9 days. He left Mara 34 years old, 160 acres in debt, and a 10-year-old son named Owen. He also left a spring crop half-planted and a banknote due before the first autumn frost. 3 neighbors suggested Mara sell while the house and barn still had enough value to attract a buyer. Mara folded Thomas's canvas coat and left it on the chair beside the stove. Then she sharpened his plow blade and went outside. Her long auburn braids stayed tucked beneath a faded brown hat, and Thomas's red neckerchief remained tied around her throat. The homestead sat 5 miles west of Red Hollow, where short grass rolled toward a shallow creek and an endless sky. In a wet year, the place could support wheat, chickens, and a small herd. That year had not been wet. By early May, the creek showed gravel between narrow threads of brown water. Mara owned the plow, but Thomas's remaining workhorse had gone lame 2 weeks before his death. Without another animal, 40 acres of unbroken ground might as well have been 40 miles of stone. Silas Boone owned the largest cattle outfit in the county and nearly every strong draft animal within a day's ride. He was 52, broad across the shoulders, with a gray mustache, black vest, and a pale hat visible from half a pasture away. Silas had offered to buy the Ellison place twice before Thomas was buried. His reason was not difficult to understand. The Ellison well reached water even during dry summers, while several Boone wells were already dropping. Silas had 800 cattle depending on grass and water, and drought made sentiment expensive. Mara understood his problem without volunteering to become its solution. She rode into Red Hollow and asked Silas to rent her 1 draft horse for 3 days. He told her every useful animal was preparing for the summer cattle work. Mara offered to pay after harvest. Silas looked toward the empty street and said a harvest was exactly what he doubted she would have. Mara turned toward her wagon before saying anything she might enjoy too much. Silas stopped her beside the hitching rail and said there was 1 animal she could take for nothing. Behind Boone's livery barn stood a dark gray mule with a white muzzle and a deep scar across his left shoulder. The tip of his right ear was split, and dust had settled permanently into the rough hair along his back. His name was Cinder. Silas explained that Cinder ignored shouted commands, walked when other animals trotted, and stopped whenever a driver became impatient. 3 ranch hands had tried him during spring work and returned him before lunch. One called the mule stubborn enough to argue with a fence post. Silas said, "If you can make him useful, he is yours." Mara answered, "You are giving away something you already decided has no value." Silas admitted that was one way to describe the arrangement. Mara entered the pen carrying neither whip nor feed. Cinder watched her with dark eyes but did not turn when Silas slammed the gate behind them. Mara noticed that first. She walked around his right side and softly clicked her tongue. Cinder kept watching the place where she had been standing. Mara moved into his sight again and lifted one hand. His ears turned only slightly, but his eyes followed every movement. She placed the halter over his nose without resistance. Silas said that getting a halter on him was easier than getting work out of him. Mara led Cinder toward the wagon. Halfway there, a blacksmith dropped an iron bar behind the mule. 2 nearby horses jerked their heads. Cinder never moved. Mara looked at the mule, then at the fallen iron. Silas mistook her interest for doubt and reminded her the offer could still be withdrawn. Mara tied Cinder behind the wagon and said she had heard enough. Cinder had not. Owen met them at the homestead gate and stared at the scarred mule with open disappointment. He had imagined his mother returning with one of Boone's heavy chestnut workhorses. Instead, Cinder looked like an animal assembled from leftover parts. Owen asked whether the mule was sick. Mara said, "Not that I can see." Owen asked why anyone would give away a healthy mule. Mara looked at Cinder and said that was what they were going to discover. Their first attempt at plowing lasted less than 5 minutes. Mara hitched Cinder beside the lame workhorse and called for both animals to walk. The horse stepped forward. Cinder stood still. Mara called again, louder. The mule blinked at a grasshopper. Owen suggested that Boone might have underestimated exactly how useless Cinder was. Mara walked to the mule's head instead of arguing. When she touched 2 fingers behind his left jaw, Cinder turned toward her immediately. She pressed gently against his shoulder. He stepped sideways. Mara returned to the lines and gave a small pull through the harness before speaking. Cinder walked. Mara stopped calling commands and began testing pressures instead. A light pull meant walk, 2 short taps meant stop, and steady pressure on one line asked for a turn. Cinder learned none of those signals. He already knew them. By evening, Mara understood that someone had worked the mule carefully before Boone's ranch hands ever touched him. What she did not understand was why voice commands seemed to mean almost nothing. Owen solved part of the question by accident. He approached Cinder from behind while carrying a bucket and called the mule's name. Cinder kept drinking. Owen touched his flank. The mule startled so hard that half the water left the trough. Mara spent the next hour trying sounds from different distances and directions. Cinder reacted to the deepest clap at close range but ignored ordinary voices unless he could see the speaker. Mara finally said, "He is nearly deaf." Owen looked toward Red Hollow and said Boone had given them a broken mule. Mara answered that deaf was not the same as broken. The next morning, she tied a strip of red cloth to Cinder's harness where he could see it beside his cheek. She paired each rain signal with a visible hand motion whenever she worked from the ground. Owen learned never to approach the mule from behind without stepping into his sight first. Within a week, Cinder pulled the plow alone. He was slower than a strong horse, but his pace barely changed from sunrise until noon. He did not waste strength fighting the harness or reacting to every wagon rattling past the road. Mara began finishing rows she had expected to abandon. Red Hollow noticed. People also noticed that Mara was plowing a strange strip around the house instead of planting every piece of usable ground. The strip began 20 yards from the barn and curved around the homestead in a rough circle. Mara cut the grass low, turned the dry sod, and removed piles of brush left from winter. Owen asked why they were wasting soil when the bank expected a harvest. Mara pointed at the hills, where every week without rain had changed green grass to yellow. Thomas had once told her that drought did not become dangerous when the well emptied. It became dangerous when the entire horizon turned into fuel. Mara called the bare strip a firebreak. Owen called it the field where nothing would grow. Both descriptions were correct. Silas Boone rode past during the second week of June and stopped beside the freshly turned dirt. He asked whether Mara planned to harvest dust. Mara said she planned to keep fire from harvesting the house. Silas looked over miles of dry country and admitted grass fires happened most summers. He also said sacrificing good ground to fear was how small farms became smaller. Mara reminded him that his ranch could afford to lose an acre more easily than she could afford to lose a roof. Silas looked toward the gray mule pulling the plow. Cinder passed within 10 feet of his horse without reacting to a shouted greeting. Mara told Silas the mule was almost deaf. For the first time, Silas stopped smiling. He said he had never known. Mara asked whether anyone had bothered to find out. Silas had no useful answer. Cinder's scar became another question Mara could not solve. It curved from the top of his left shoulder toward his chest, too broad for barbed wire and too old to remain tender. He also carried a faded mark beneath his mane that did not belong to any local ranch. Mara copied the shape onto a scrap of paper when she rode into town for flour. The blacksmith did not recognize it. Neither did the sheriff. An old freight driver named Frank Morrow saw the drawing while drinking coffee at the general store. Frank was 68 and walked with one stiff knee from 30 years on wagon seats and bad roads. He asked Mara to draw the mark again. Then he said he had seen it on animals owned by a railroad grading contractor almost a decade earlier. The contractor used mule teams to haul dirt, timber, and powder through the mountain cuts west of Denver. Frank remembered one gray mule because an early dynamite charge exploded before the work crew cleared the grade. 2 wagons overturned, several animals bolted, and one mule was thrown against a rock shelf. The gray mule survived with a shoulder wound. Afterward, he stopped responding properly to voices and bells. The grading foreman trained him with pressure signals because the mule remained steady around blasting that frightened younger teams. Frank could not swear Cinder was that animal. Mara could. The scar, the faded contractor mark, and the old harness signals fit together too well. Cinder had not spent years refusing to obey. Men had spent years giving him orders he could barely hear. Mara returned home with flour, coffee, and an entirely different understanding of her mule. She stopped trying to make Cinder work like a horse. Instead, she rebuilt the harness so every request reached him through pressure he could feel. One long pull meant stop. 2 quick touches against the right line meant turn right. A tap against the harness bar meant step forward. Owen practiced the signals until Cinder could follow him around the yard without a spoken word. The boy began saying that Cinder listened better than most people in Red Hollow. Mara told him not to confuse listening with hearing. By July, Cinder could pull a plow, water barrel, hay sled, and small wagon entirely through touch signals. He still moved slowly. Mara stopped considering that a defect. Slow animals made fewer mistakes when the person behind them knew where they were going. If you enjoy frontier stories where overlooked strengths matter more than appearances, subscribe. There are more lives like Mara's beyond the next stretch of open country. The summer grew hotter. By the middle of July, wagon wheels left powder instead of tracks on the road into Red Hollow. Farmers carried shovels in their wagons because a single spark from an iron rim could start trouble. Silas Boone moved part of his herd closer to the Ellison Creek. Mara allowed his cattle to drink twice after Boone's western well failed. She refused payment. Silas asked whether that meant she had reconsidered selling. Mara said it meant thirsty cattle had done nothing to offend her. Silas laughed despite himself. Their disagreements became less sharp after that, though neither person mistook peace for surrender. Red Hollow's schoolhouse stood 2 miles east of town, beside a low ridge and a narrow cottonwood creek. The building was stone because the first wooden school had burned 15 years earlier. Helen Price taught 12 children there, including Silas Boone's 9-year-old daughter, Lucy. Owen attended when farm work allowed it, and complained that Helen assigned arithmetic whenever the weather was nicest. Mara told him arithmetic looked much friendlier after winter chores. Near the end of July, Helen brought the children to the Ellison farm to collect prairie flowers for a lesson. Cinder stood beside the barn while 12 children tested how loudly they could call his name. The mule ignored every one of them. Lucy Boone declared him the rudest animal in Colorado. Owen showed her the hand signals. Lucy touched 2 fingers against the mule's neck, and Cinder turned toward her. The children became quiet for the first time that afternoon. Mara explained that Cinder could not hear most of what they heard. Helen asked whether loud noises frightened him. Mara said only noises strong enough to become vibrations seemed to reach him. Helen looked toward the yellow grass and said that might be useful during a bad storm. Mara looked at her firebreak and said she was more worried about a dry one. 2 days later, a cooking fire escaped from a sheep camp south of town. Men contained it before it crossed more than half an acre. The incident was small enough to become a joke by supper. Mara did not laugh. She hitched Cinder the next morning and widened the bare strip around her barn. She also plowed a straight lane from the house toward the shallow creek. Owen asked why a firebreak needed a road. Mara said people needed somewhere to move when standing still stopped being safe. She stored 2 barrels of water on the wagon and kept old wool blankets beside them. She placed shovels near both doors and cleared hay from the outside wall of the barn. Silas saw the preparations and told her she was building a fort against weather. Mara answered that weather had defeated better forts. August arrived without rain. The prairie grass became pale enough to disappear against the noon sky. Even grasshoppers seemed to move carefully. On the 17th morning of the month, a hot wind began blowing from the southwest. It strengthened through noon and carried dust high enough to turn the distant hills gray. Mara sent Owen to school because she needed him away from the fields while she repaired the well cover. Before he left, she made him promise to stay with Helen if smoke appeared anywhere west of the schoolhouse. Owen said there was no smoke. Mara told him promises were usually made before they were needed. Shortly after noon, a freight train climbed the grade south of Red Hollow. The engine worked hard against the wind, throwing dark smoke behind its stack. A ranch hand later swore he saw sparks fall near a patch of dry grass beside the track. Nobody saw the first flame. They saw the second mile of it. A rider reached the Ellison farm at a gallop and shouted that fire was moving northeast. Mara climbed onto the fence and saw a low black line beneath the southern sky. It looked thin from a distance. The smoke above it did not. Mara hitched Cinder before the rider finished describing the fire. She soaked 2 blankets, loaded her shovels, and drove toward Red Hollow. Cinder felt the harness taps and moved into the hot wind without hearing the warning bell already ringing in town. Silas Boone had gathered nearly 30 men beside the general store. His plan was to plow a wide fire break south of town before the flames reached the county road. Mara asked about the schoolhouse. Silas said Helen had the children and a wagon. Mara asked whether anyone had actually reached them. Nobody answered. Silas sent 2 riders east while the remaining men began cutting dirt across the prairie. For half an hour their plan worked. Then the wind shifted. A southern gust became a hard western wind that bent smoke toward the school road. The fire did not turn like a single wall. Burning grass lifted into the air and started smaller fires hundreds of yards ahead. One of the riders returned without his hat. He said the school wagon had tried to leave. The horses panicked when smoke crossed the road and overturned the wagon near the gate. Helen had taken every child back into the stone building. The second rider remained there to help. Silas immediately called for 4 fresh horses. Mara looked at the smoke rolling across the eastern road and said fresh horses would smell the same fire. Silas said his daughter was inside that school. Mara answered, "So is my son." They stopped arguing. The first rescue wagon made it less than 100 yards outside town. Its matched bays turned sideways when a burning tumbleweed crossed the road. The driver barely cut them free before the wagon tipped into the ditch. A second team refused to pass the livery barn as ash began falling into the street. Men who had spent their lives controlling horses discovered there were some fears reins could not defeat. Mara walked Cinder into the street. The mule saw the smoke and lifted his head. A storage shed collapsed behind the blacksmith shop with a crack loud enough to send 3 horses backward. Cinder felt the ground tremble and stepped sideways. Mara placed her hand against his neck until he looked at her. She gave the familiar forward signal. Cinder walked. Silas said 1 mule could not bring 12 children through a prairie fire. Mara said she did not intend to drive through the fire. She intended to make a road the fire had already lost. South of the schoolhouse ran a shallow drainage cut where cattle had eaten the grass nearly to the soil. Mara had crossed it many times on the way to town. If they widened that bare ground with a plow, it could become a narrow corridor between the school and the creek. The problem was reaching it before the eastern edge of the fire did. Silas studied the map Mara scratched into the street with the heel of her boot. The route crossed his uncut hay meadow. Saving the corridor meant plowing through the only winter feed he still expected to harvest. Mara waited while Silas looked toward the smoke hiding his daughter. He finally said, "Cut every acre you need." They hitched Cinder to the heaviest walking plow in Red Hollow. Mara took the lines, while Silas and 3 men followed with wet sacks and shovels. Another wagon carried water barrels behind them until its horses could go no farther. Mara transferred the smaller barrel onto Cinder's cart. The mule now pulled the plow, emergency water, and the hope of 2 families at the same slow pace he had always used. Smoke reduced the school ridge to a dark shape. Burning grass rushed across the southern pasture faster than a man could comfortably run. Cinder could see the flames. He could smell them. What he could not hear was the endless roar that had already broken every horse they tried. Mara kept one hand low on the reins, so every instruction reached him through the harness. At the edge of Boone's meadow, she dropped the plow blade. Dry roots fought the iron. Cinder leaned forward until the traces tightened against his chest. The ground opened. Behind them appeared a dark strip of soil where yellow grass had stood seconds earlier. Silas and the others widened it with shovels wherever clumps remained. Burning grass reached the first end of the meadow. The heat struck Mara's face even though the nearest flames remained hundreds of feet away. Cinder slowed. Mara did not whip him or shout. She stepped beside his head, placed her palm against the white muzzle, and waited until his eyes settled on hers. Then she touched the harness bar once. Cinder leaned into the traces again. The new fire break reached the cattle cut moments before sparks began falling around them. Silas ordered the men into the bare channel and beat out every ember that landed ahead. Mara lifted the plow and turned Cinder toward the schoolhouse. The stone building appeared through smoke less than half a mile away. Children had soaked coats and blankets at the hand pump and pushed them against gaps beneath the doors. Helen had moved every desk away from the windows and kept the children low against the stone walls. Owen stood beside the pump filling another bucket when he saw his mother's red neckerchief through the smoke. Lucy Boone saw Cinder and shouted the mule's name before remembering he could not hear her. Cinder did not need to. Mara brought the cart beside the school door and told Helen they had one usable route to the creek. The flames were approaching from the south and west, while the plowed corridor remained open to the north. They could not fit every child into the small cart at once. Mara loaded the youngest 6 and told the older children to hold the wet blankets over their heads. Helen climbed onto the rear step, while Silas and the men formed a line beside the wagon. Owen asked whether his mother was riding with them. Mara said she would walk beside Cinder where he could see her. They started toward the corridor as burning grass reached the schoolyard fence. The first section of fence went down behind them in a shower of sparks. Cinder felt the vibration through the ground and jerked the cart sideways. One wheel slipped off the plowed track into dry grass. Mara stopped him immediately. Silas and 2 men pushed the wheel back onto bare soil before sparks reached the wagon. Mara touched Cinder's shoulder twice. The mule stepped forward. They reached the creek less than 10 minutes before fire swept across Boone's meadow on both sides of the blackened corridor. Every child arrived alive, though the schoolhouse roof burned through before midnight. Mara returned home after dark and found her own barn blackened along one wall. The fire break she had plowed weeks earlier had stopped the flames 20 feet from the house. She lost half her hay, 2 fences, and nearly every unharvested acre, but the roof remained above Owen's bed. Silas lost most of his meadow because he had chosen children over winter feed. Before the first snow, half the county brought him spare hay without being asked. He never offered to buy Mara's homestead again. Instead, he brought lumber for her burned barn and worked beside her until the new wall stood straight. Cinder spent several days beneath the cottonwoods with singed hair along one flank and more apples than one mule required. Lucy Boone still called him rude, but only because he continued ignoring her whenever she forgot to step into his sight. That autumn, Mara harvested less wheat than she needed to satisfy the banknote. Red Hollow's merchants extended the debt until spring before she could ask. Mara almost refused. Then she remembered how many hands had pushed one wagon wheel back onto the fire break. She signed the new note and accepted help without mistaking it for weakness. Cinder had spent years being punished because people confused obedience with understanding. Mara had spent months making a similar mistake about herself. She believed surviving alone was the only proof that she deserved to keep what Thomas had left her. The fire taught her that preparation mattered, but so did knowing when another pair of hands could carry part of the weight. Strength on the frontier was rarely one person defeating everything alone. Sometimes it was a widow plowing dirt before anyone else saw danger. Sometimes it was a rancher sacrificing his best hay because children mattered more than cattle. And sometimes it was a scarred mule whose weakness became useful only after someone bothered to understand it. A flaw can be real without making a person or animal worthless. Cinder truly could not hear most commands, and pretending otherwise would never have helped him. What changed his life was not denying the limitation, but building a better way around it. The same lesson can travel far beyond a dusty Colorado road. Before deciding something is useless, stubborn, slow, or broken, it may be worth asking what problem it was actually built to solve. Red Hollow remembered the Great Fire for the land it burned. Mara remembered it for the 12 children who came home along a road made by the mule nobody wanted. Would you have trusted Cinder enough to take him toward the smoke, or would you have waited for a stronger horse? Share your answer in the comments, and if this story stayed with you, like the video and subscribe for another journey into the American West.